Welcome, everybody. My name is Mikey Menda. I'm the Executive Director of Afikra. Thanks so much for joining. I'm very, very excited to welcome our special guest, Alya Mooro. Alya is a freelance journalist and the author of the best-selling nonfiction book, The Greater Freedom: Life as a Middle Eastern Woman Outside the Stereotypes. She is a columnist at Restless and has had bylines in New York Magazine, The Telegraph, Refinery 29, and more. She's the co-host of the podcast Bootleg Magic and writes the recently launched newsletter, The Greater Conversation. Alya holds a BA in sociology and psychology and a master's in journalism. Alya, thank you so much for joining Afikra Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to start off somewhere at the very beginning. So at what point did you decide that you wanted to become a writer? Because I think it seems that primarily you're a writer.
Yeah, increasingly I feel like I would like to fall under the category of like storyteller, but definitely writing is my, main medium. And I think for me, I started out really young. It was always a way to kind of speak to myself and kind of figure out what I was thinking. I moved around a lot when I was younger. We moved from like Egypt to Switzerland to London to Egypt back to London. So and like there was so many, when you're a teenager especially, like you kind of just have all of these feelings and you don't know what to do with them. So for me it was really very much kind of a way to come to terms with what I was feeling, what I was seeing in the world around me, and sort of come to my own conclusions about things. And it was never really anything that I knew that I could do as a career or that I really thought of doing. Like I was one of those teenagers that, didn't really think too far into the future, I guess you could say. Like I wasn't like, oh, this is what I want to do when I'm older. I kind of just took it one day at a time. Yeah. And then I studied sociology and psychology at university, still not really knowing, I thought maybe I'd be a psychotherapist. Like I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And then when I graduated from my undergraduate degree, I became friends with all of these people who were in the creative industries in London. And they were music artists and writers, and they were just doing all of these amazing things. And I think that kind of was the first time where I felt like, oh my God, like maybe I could do something similar. Like maybe I could write and that could be what I do. And then from there, I kind of really threw myself headfirst into it. I applied to all these different internships. I started a blog. And I started off predominantly writing about music, actually, and hip hop, which is how I had found all of these friends in the first place. So that was, I always say kind of a way for me to be able to practice expressing my opinion, I suppose in a relatively low stakes way, because no one can get that offended by what you think about, an artist or whatever. And then from there, long journey since then.
So I'm curious, were you writing on Blogspot? Because I think we're about the same age. I too also had some sort of Blogspot platform. And I want to imagine, were you a Tumblr person, a MySpace person, a Blogspot person? Who were you?
I had
a live journal. Live journal was also.
I had a live journal when I was like 15, and that was anonymous. And I used to cry on there every day. And actually, it's so funny because I feel like that's, a big part for me is I'm very active online. I'm very active on social media. And from then it was very natural for me to kind of be myself. And even though I was anonymous, like make friends online. And there's a girl that I became friends with on LiveJournal when I was like 15, and she's still my friend on Facebook and like Instagram and stuff now. So it's quite funny.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember the first comment I got on my Blogspot freaked me out. The first comment from somebody I didn't speak to. And I very quickly realized that anonymous writing wasn't for me. And so I'm curious what your response was. Was your response, oh my God, this is liberating, or this is suffocating?
I think at the time I needed it to be anonymous because I was going through a lot of things, at home and at school. And I needed somewhere where I could write and be anonymous. And it was quite nice because, again, I made friends with a lot of people online. and I would comment on their posts that were really intimate and personal to them, and they would comment on mine. And, you know, I was getting bullied at school. So it felt really nice for me to be able to have people that I didn't know, but that I was really able to kind of open up to.
Yeah. What was that book? I'm sure you remember. What was that series of books of like notes that people leave in books, and then it was compiled? Oh shit, what was it? It was this really famous
ones. It was all secrets.
It was all secrets. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember that book, but I can't.
It was so influential. Yeah, it was really, really influential, and I think it kind of started Post Secret. Thank you.
Yes.
Post Secret. Exactly. Yeah, I think it was really, really influential in starting this wave of sort of like storytelling the way you're describing.
Yeah, and I think there's something really cathartic in that, and you know, that's something that I always bring into my writing now, is that kind of honesty and intimacy. And I think probably, you know, being anonymous on what's it called, blogs, live journal, and all of these things, I think it kind of makes you realize that there's always someone who's going to relate to what you're saying, and in the relating, it makes both of you feel better.
So yeah. So I want to talk about that anonymity and how that translated for you into having public bylines and going into like, how am I going to actually have a brand and have a face that you're catfishing us with, and how are you going to have, like, your name is right there, your face is right there. So how have you managed that balance?
I think it was a very brief period of anonymity. Like, let me just stress that. It was kind of just when I was a teenager at school. And I think that what I, you know, realized as I got older was the power in sort of owning your story. And again, I'm very lucky in that, you know, and I stress this all the time, I'm very lucky in that my family are very supportive, and they're not the typical family of like, don't air your dirty laundry. You know, these are not things that we talk about. You know, in my book, I talk about a lot of subjects that are traditionally taboo, but for my family, you know, not to say that they weren't like, no, I guess they weren't really shocked, but I feel like that support enabled me to be able to do that. So I kind of feel like I'm lucky in that I'm able to, you know, even my dad was like, oh, well, would you want to be anonymous to publish your book? And I was like, no way. How can I like own my story and talk about the importance of not feeling ashamed, which is so much of what my work centers on, if I'm being anonymous? Like, that completely contradicts the point. But I think probably being anonymous initially, again, when I was young, gave me the courage to speak honestly, and I guess the stakes were lower because it wasn't me. And then in sort of gaining that courage, I own it all now.
Yeah. So let's sort of zoom back, stay in the framework of you as a, you know, you're writing hip hop reviews. Who are you reading? Are you reading, you know, what are you reading?
At the time,
who influenced the way you write and the way you think probably the most? Because I feel like when you read people, you can hear the input, the output, you can match the output to the input, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure if I've ever really thought about it. Like, I've always been a huge reader. So I still, till this day, I read pretty much nonstop. And, you know, ever since, I'm kind of one of those people that, like, I really throw myself into something. So when I was like, okay, I'm going to start journalism, I subscribed to like every single magazine. I, you know, would spend hours on the internet kind of reading all of this different content kind of thing. So I feel like whatever world I'm tapping into, I very much just completely absorb myself in it. I know that, well, funnily enough, I used to basically be in love with Lil Wayne. So Lil Wayne, the rapper.
Yeah, for sure.
So that
I
was,
lived in New Orleans. There's nothing wrong with that.
oh my God, I loved him so much. Like I
Yeah,
can't
for
even
sure.
explain how much. That's why I'm a bit bashful, because I'm like, if you knew the depths of this.
Very crucially, which album allowed you to fall into his music? Because is it the Carter 3 or the
No,
Carter
it was
2?
like the No Ceilings mixtape, I think.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, nice.
Yeah,
Like
yeah. No,
2009,
I'm
2008, 2009, 2010.
I'm like an OG fan.
Nice.
But so that kind of also brought me into this world, and I used to love, Karen Civil, who did a lot of his marketing, and she was kind of one of the, she
Yeah, I
helped
don't know who this is.
Beats by Dre, and she did all of these things. So I found her really inspiring, and I think what I've always found really interesting is the way that you can kind of like enter a world and do so many different things in it. So, as much as I was like, I'm going to be a journalist, I also sort of immediately tapped into the kind of online world, immediately tapped into all the different ways essentially of telling the story. I didn't want to just be a journalist kind of in a newsroom. I wanted to always be able to do it the way I wanted to do it.
Yeah, so when you say storytelling, do you feel like you're drawn to telling, quote unquote, your story more than you are drawn to telling, quote unquote, the story?
Quote unquote, which, sorry? My story versus what?
The story?
What's
like your story or the story? Yeah.
Well, I feel like it's quite difficult to separate them, because my story is linked to the world story and linked to like so many other things. So, even in terms of the greater freedom, it follows my thread, but I've kind of decentered myself, I think, a little bit in the book, in terms of like, I bring in a lot of other people's experiences. I have like statistics in there. I kind of have history, we are like, whatever we are is positioned in the wider context of things. So I think my lens will be through my eyes, through my experience, through my story, but I'm ultimately trying to tap into something bigger in sharing that.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to ask you a question that we talked about briefly before the call. I heard in an interview you talked about how this book took you about 2 years to write. So how old were you when you started this book?
I was about, I think I was like 27.
Okay, so what did the 27-year-old who mustered up the courage to say, I think I want to write a book, which is not doesn't take a small amount of courage. What did that person think that it may be different than the 29-year-old who finished writing the book? Like, what did you learn and how did you change over that course of 2 years?
I literally completely changed. I became a completely different person.
Did the idea change as well? Did you start writing a different book than you finished?
Yeah, I would say probably. I think, I definitely plotted out, when I was going into it, I very much wrote down all the things that I wanted to address. And those were all the things that I addressed. But I think in doing the research and in kind of speaking to all of these different women in the way that I did for the book, and in kind of, I interviewed my parents, in kind of really digging deep, I think my ideas changed, but the things I wanted to, but that's what I kind of wanted to do with the book. So like I say that it was a bit of a selfish endeavor, because the reason why I wanted to write the book is because I had all of these questions. And in writing them, I think I came to my conclusions about them. Whether those are the same conclusions now, not always. I think I've definitely been building on them. But I think what I really wanted to do was sort of open the conversation for myself and for other people, so that we could even start to unpick these things, because so much of what I talk about in the book is these kind of expectations and limits almost that we're kind of born into, right? So like each chapter in the book is like when you learn how you're supposed to look, like when you're not supposed to like sex, when you're, you know, all of these different things essentially. So I feel like what I really wanted to do was free myself and free other people to reach their own conclusions. It wasn't necessarily that I was saying this is the way it should be, or this is right, or this is wrong. It was almost just like, can we think about this? Because, you know, why are we not?
Yeah. So fast forward 2 years later, this book, I mean, those conversations you were probably having privately with family and friends, maybe, if I'm being generous, maybe up to like 100 people. Now, quite literally, thousands and tens of thousands of people have read the book. And what it means to be a Middle Eastern, like life as a Middle Eastern woman, I mean, that's a huge statement, because there are millions of Middle Eastern women, and you've reached many of them now, who all have very different experiences than any other single person in that group. So I guess my question is, 2 years later, if you were to update this book with like a paperback edition, like now new and improved, the even greater freedom, what do you add to this book that wasn't included because you didn't have that perspective? You hadn't heard back from all these different people.
You know, I feel like I don't think I would update the book, because I feel like that in the book,
it's like a historical document.
Yeah, like that was how I felt at the time. And those were like, it was kind of me figuring it out along with the reader. You know what I mean? It was kind of me asking those questions and sort of starting to even think about them. So I feel like I'm happy with it the way that it is. What I have done is I've launched a newsletter called The Greater Conversation.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a way to continue the conversation ultimately, because, you know, I've received so many amazing messages from all of these different Middle Eastern women, and, you know, women from other ethnicities as well, and men, and, you know, all the rest of it, sharing their experiences with me. You know, in my Instagram DMs, being like, oh my God, I related to this so much because this is my life, or, you know, oh, I didn't relate to this because this is my life. So the newsletter comes out every week, and in each edition, there's a guest piece from a different Middle Eastern woman. And that's kind of a way of, you know, passing the mic a little bit, but also providing a space for these different experiences to be told, because there's no way that, you know, one book or one experience can speak to every single person. And that wasn't what I was trying to do. I was just sharing my experience in the hopes that we would be able to have these conversations ultimately, because I didn't feel like, you know, and I think there's a lot more things happening now, but when I first started writing the book, I didn't see anything like it. You know, I didn't see any piece of content or any book that I felt like I could relate to, or that spoke to me or my experience. So I kind of felt like, cool, like, what am I waiting for? Let me do it.
Yeah, so I have a couple questions. The first is, what do you think, I mean, I kind of hate this question, but just cringe through it with me for a second. Like, what does success sort of look like in terms of the readers who are reading it? You know, like, I would imagine you were writing this book for yourself, but now this is, any book is kind of owned by the reader once it leaves your inbox.
Yeah.
And so what do you hope it does, or what do you hope the effect is for people, or do you not even really think about that?
No, I definitely think about that. And I think, you know, what's been so, like, initially when I was writing the book, I was like, it's going to be like New York Times best. You know, I had all of these weird, like, I'm going to be on Oprah, like random, silly, like quite childish definitions of success, right? And, you know, in the year and a half, well, just over a year since it's been released, again, I've been receiving all these amazing messages, and my definition of success has really changed to mean that, like the people that it's reached and the way that it's impacted them. So I've received so many messages from people being like, you know, this gave me the courage to speak to my parents, or this gave me the courage to feel like maybe I can live my authentic life, that maybe it's fine if I'm 30 and I'm not married, you know, in the way that my family think that I should be. And actually one of the things that was most powerful for me was my mom's reaction to the book. So she was understandably super nervous, and I didn't let my family read it until it was actually like printed and in book form, because I didn't want anything that they said to change my kind of conviction about it, sort of thing. And my mom, you know, came to me and she cried so much reading it. And she was like, you know, I think in the way that you've described it, I think I'm a feminist too. You know, I think maybe, and it kind of gave her the courage to feel like there's this term that I call in the book, which is the invisible jury, which is essentially the opinions and the kind of judgments of everyone. Which I think that as women and as Arab women and as humans in general, we're very much told to think about, you know, what will they say? Yeah. What will your aunt say? What will the web say? Like, what's everyone gonna think? You know, and my mom said to me, I actually don't really care what they think anymore. And it kind of freed her in that sense. And she was like, you've basically written this book for me, for your grandmothers who didn't have the freedom to be who they want to be, for, you know, and that was so powerful for me to hear, like, you wrote this for your grandmother who was not allowed to speak up. Like, that really hit a special kind of nerve in me.
So, yeah, I'm curious about this, like longitudinally and geographically, what the response has been. So your family is from Egypt originally. What has the response been from your readers in Egypt?
You know, interestingly, a lot of the same. I think it's obviously differs in ways in terms of, like, you know, and even my dad has said this to me, if you lived in Egypt, I would have probably had to raise you a little bit differently with like a bit less freedom, because there is this kind of, you know, when in Rome kind of idea. But a lot, and I guess there's layers to it as well, right? Because we know that there's so many different worlds. So like my friends in Egypt, for example, or the people who are able to, you know, read English and stuff, that's already kind of a portion of the population versus like everyone else. And they, you know, arguably are traveled and perhaps have more this kind of clash of culture or expectation. So a lot of them really understood. I think one of the things that was quite interesting was, you know, there were a few people, and I remember very well, one of my mom's friends said to me, you know, you shouldn't show the dirty laundry. And she kind of gave me this example of her mom or something who had kind of been showing these tourists to Egypt, the pyramids. And they were driving past the pyramids, and on one side, you know, beautiful pyramids, on the other side is rubbish in the streets. And she was telling me how her mom had kind of like, you know, really tried to keep their attention on the pyramids and like, don't look at the rubbish kind of thing. And she was like, why did you also show the rubbish? And I was like, well, no, because you have to. And also, if we're not able to have these conversations about our own cultures, then where do we go from here? You know, it's almost like you need to bring things to the light in order to be able to address them, in order to be able to move past them. And I'm not an ambassador for my culture. The fact that I should be, or the fact that I'm expected to be, is in part the problem, right? Because there are so few stories. We can't all just be like, look how amazing everything is, because that's not true. That's not authentic. And it's not to say, you know, and I really made an effort to do this throughout the whole book, where it wasn't like, these are the problems with Arab culture. A lot of it actually is to do with the patriarchal world that we live in. And the fact that a lot of these ideas, a lot of these expectations stem to women in all countries and in all cultures and in all religions. And it's not at all just Arabs or just Muslims or whatever. But if we're not able to address it and we're not able to talk about it, then where the hell do we go from here?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I start talking about your podcasting and some of the other stuff you're doing, I'm curious about the title, because titles are very intentional. The Greater Freedom, first of all, the and greater rather than great. These are intentional choices. Why did you name it The Greater Freedom?
So the book had many iterations of titles. I think the first one, which is horrific, which I probably shouldn't even share, was something like Sex, Bacon, and Being Brown, like something horrific like that. And then it was Both and Neither. And so it was quite interesting because my publishers are Amazon Publishing, so an imprint of them, which is called Little A. So I was one of the first nonfiction books under Little A. And because there's such a digital, like it's Amazon, right? So when they bought the book they bought the idea of the book with the title Both and Neither, and then they said that that's really bad for search. So that my editor at the time actually spent like a whole night going through the whole proposal, which I had submitted, and he picked out The Greater Freedom, which was part of a sentence that I had written initially. And he was like, I think that this is what your book is about. I think it's about the greater freedom to like be yourself, basically. And I was like, oh my God, 100%, you're so spot on. And then it felt really serendipitous because then my agent sent me an email. She had kind of Googled those 3 words and she had found this quote, which actually is the first page of the book now, which basically says, freedom to be oneself is all very well. The greater freedom is not to be oneself. And I think that wholly sums up the ethos of the book. And, you know, so much of my work is this idea of like, yeah, freedom to not even need to be the version of yourself that you think you're supposed to be, or that people have told you you should be. It's to kind of be able to unpick all of that and be yourself, whatever that means to you.
Yeah. And to allow that to change, right? So
exactly. Yeah. I think we keep becoming. We're not at all, you know, one fixed thing. And I think that's really exciting in itself.
So how do you manage that? Because I would imagine that there are I would imagine that you feel a responsibility because there may be people who think that you're telling them to be something, and you're like, no, I'm not telling you to be anything, whether it's like a replica of me or a replica of the journey I was going through, you're going through your own journey. How do you manage that? Because it feels like this sort of inverted thinking, but I could imagine that. Like I went through that when I was younger. Like you would listen to all this counterculture music, but everyone was listening to it. So how counterculture is it, right?
Yeah, well, you know, I definitely feel like I'm never like I know all the answers at all. I've never felt like that. And so much of the book, as I mentioned, is me kind of trying to even find the answers for myself. So I feel like I'm by no means, you know, an example or like any of these things. I think I'm just saying, let's think about it, like let's ask. And I'm very conscious, you know, on social media, especially to show my workings out, you know, like I very often kind of post myself having like a freak out about, you know, work or about something. I very often kind of tap into the community, my community online, to find out what they think when I'm writing an article. I very much did that throughout the whole course of the book. I had so many interesting conversations with people online. I'd be like, I'm writing about this chapter, like what do you guys think? And you know, it felt like a very collaborative thing, and I think that's something that I bring to all my work. I definitely don't feel like I have all the answers at all, and I think that's what keeps me curious, and that's very much what keeps me doing the work that I do.
That's amazing. So I'm posting a bunch of images for those people who are listening and not watching, different articles you've written. I won't go through them right now because I really want to talk about your sort of work with Nasri, for Bootleg Magic. What was the impetus for launching this? What's the sort of conceit of this program, and how's it going so far?
So as you can see, the last episode was in August, which is super sad. We're hoping to bring it back pronto. We're kind of just like figuring out season 2, and we have a few things in the works, which we're really excited about. But basically, Nasri and I connected as like 2 Arab creatives living in London. And we were approached to, would you guys want to start a podcast? It never kind of took shape, and time went on, and then lockdown happened. And we were like, fuck it, like we're both at home, we need to kind of keep ourselves busy and like keep doing stuff basically. So we were like, let's just give it a go and see how it goes. And, I think it's been really great to do the first season and sort of figure out what were the things that we really enjoyed about it, what was the feedback that we got, and what is it that we really want to do with it. And I think what matters a lot to both of us is kind of highlighting Arab creatives, Arab stories, and sort of just giving, there's so many amazing things I think happening in the region at the moment and in the diaspora. The show Rami, there's so many books coming out, there's so much music, there's what you guys are doing, like there's just so many amazing things happening. And I think we just want to help spotlight that and help kind of have these conversations and essentially have really interesting conversations with our peers ultimately, because I think there's so much good stuff that can come out of that. And also I always say, like, it's easier to be yourself if you can see yourself. And I think that also goes back to why I always try show my workings out, because I feel like we need more stories. We need more people to kind of feel like they can write a song or write a book or whatever. And the more that we kind of have these conversations and the more that this stuff comes to light, I think there'll be more, and we need that.
That's fantastic. I love that. The more you can be yourself, the more you see yourself, the more you can be yourself. I love that. Okay, we're going to do this quick Q&A, and then we will open it up to everybody.
God, time is flying. I just looked at the time. I'm like, wait, what?
Yeah. Okay, so what are you reading or watching right now?
So I'm reading Sex at Dawn, which is mind-blowing. It came out about 10 years ago, actually, but it's basically about how monogamy is a lie, and like all of these kind of ideas that we've been told about sex and relationships and all of that kind of stuff. A lot of them actually came from the Victorian era, and we've just been building on that knowledge since then. But actually, a lot of it is quite sexist and quite repressed and not very accurate. So that's amazing. Cool. I would highly recommend it. And then in that,
who's the author?
I don't know. It's a bit far from me to grab it right now.
Yeah, that's okay.
It's a cool.
I'm sure somebody in the chat will put it in the link.
Yeah, it's Sex at Dawn. Honestly, it is so brilliant. I can't even stress that enough. Yeah. And then in that video,
the original title was also Both and Neither, but
and I'm watching, it's on Amazon Prime. It's called American Playboy, and it's a docu-series about Hugh Hefner and how he kind of contributed so much to the sex positivity movement and even to the civil rights movement, and how he was really ahead of his time with Playboy, actually, which is, I'm really enjoying watching.
Cool. All right. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I feel like maybe this is like a really basic answer, but I'd really like to shadow Oprah. I feel like she just has a really great energy, and I'd really love to get a bit more insight into her work and just all of that. I think she's really, really.
Would you be constantly looking under your seat to see if there's like a free car?
I don't know how to drive.
Yeah. Okay, what do people most misunderstand about your work?
That I feel like people have this idea that being a writer is quite glamorous, or perhaps quite like Sex in the City, and I'm just like sitting with all my shoes. And, you know, definitely during the pandemic, that is even more not the case. But yeah, it's really not glamorous at all. I basically sit at my desk in tracksuits and try and pull ideas out of my brain. Like a lot of, especially as a freelance journalist, a lot of it comes from me. So like I have to think of the idea, I have to pitch. I get so many rejections, like most people in creative industries. Like you get so many no's and you only need one yes. So I think that's probably what people misunderstand, is they think that it's all like easy peasy and, oh, I'm just doing all of this stuff. But actually a lot of it is you kind of batting away the rejections and sort of staying persistent and not getting sad when people tell you no.
Yeah. Great. For the record, I would trade so many shoes for tracksuits anyway, so I think you're winning that. Okay, whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
So many people. I think who comes to mind now, and perhaps it's because I recently interviewed her, is this journalist storyteller called Noor Tagouri. So she's absolutely killing it in the US. She calls herself a storyteller. She has a podcast. She did a bunch of really interesting documentaries. She's really inspiring. And I think, you know, it was really great to get to chat to her a couple of weeks ago. And she gave me a lot of really interesting, just the way that she thinks about things, I found really interesting. And sort of she said something that I think really resonated with me, which was essentially that, like, she always thinks about how the story she's telling is gonna affect the person or the communities that she's representing by telling that story. And that's very much something that I try and do in my work. It's not about, you know, there's this idea I think of journalists as like trying to catch people out and like trying to like be quite salacious. And I think there's this new way of storytelling. You know, obviously not all journalists are like that, and that's tabloid journalism, which is something else entirely. But I definitely think that there's this new way of being a storyteller, which is something that I relate to, which is, I think, yeah, again, like putting yourself in the story and being the face of your work.
Yeah, for sure. Great. Okay, I'm going to transition to our Q&A from the audience. The first question comes from Sara.
Hi, Alya.
Hey.
So nice to meet you, Mikey. Good to see you. Thank you so much for putting this together. This is, you know, something I'm deeply interested in, Mikey. Feels personal. My question is, you know, on what you said regarding throwing yourself into whatever world you're tapping into and reading all the books and subscribing to all the magazines and, you know, searching for new people to glean inspiration from. When does it stop? I've been, you know, dealing with this. It's kind of this over like mental stimulation, never really putting pen to paper and starting. How do you know that you've gained enough, or at least like what is that trigger or that turning point for you? What does that look like?
That's a really good question, and I think it is quite tricky. I feel like often what I do is I'll do them kind of in tandem. So I'm not like, okay, let me absorb all of this stuff and then I'll be ready. I kind of start, and while I'm doing it, I'm sort of still part of this world, you know? And actually, to go back to my interview that I had with Noor Tagouri, she said something that was so interesting, where she basically said, like, you know, we were talking about this idea of like procrastination, essentially. And we were saying, you know, we procrastinate most of the time because we're afraid. So we're afraid of what's going to come out, or we're afraid that we're not going to do it as well as we think we're going to do it. But actually, that's just ego, ultimately. So it's kind of like done is better than perfect, right? And it's sort of just kind of blocking out that sort of part of your brain that says, no, you're not ready yet. No, you need to do more. You need to do more research, because at the end of the day, we're never going to have all the answers. We're never going to know everything. So it's kind of just like, yeah, just doing it, I think, and knowing that you might change your mind, you might grow, you might, but that's fine.
Great. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ala. Abdul Rahman, I think you're up next.
Hello, actually, my brother was using my Zoom account, so he
I was going to
wrote
say,
me.
you don't sound like Abdul Rahman.
Really sorry about that.
What's your name, just for the record?
It's Celine Jamil from Lebanon.
Oh, hi, Celine. Great.
Hi. So my question was, in this world of increasing storytelling, when in social media you have like a million stories being told every day, and all forms of storytelling, visual, verbal, brief, long form. So how do you feel how do you define yourself as a storyteller in the 21st century, and what kind of values, or perhaps like what kind of qualities you feel would make you unique as a storyteller, or maybe what is the purpose behind your storytelling?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like it's so exciting that there's so many different ways of telling stories. And I think it's, once you so for me, I feel like what I really try and do is, be honest, is to kind of provide this narrative that I don't feel like I see enough, which is this kind of, Middle Eastern woman living in the West and kind of doing what she wants. And I feel like that's kind of the USP, is sort of the honesty and the sort of way that I see the world, right? Which is what everyone has unique to them. So I think it's kind of like figuring out what is the best medium to tell that story. Like sometimes it's a book, sometimes it's an article, sometimes it's a podcast, sometimes it's like something on social media. And I think that's, again, what's so exciting about being a storyteller in 2021 is that anyone can tell the stories that they want to tell, and anyone can do it in whatever way they want, basically. So it's kind of just having the, again, the courage and I think the kind of perseverance to do that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Great. Thanks, Celine. We have a question from Pearl. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering what if you knew the author of the quote that's now at the beginning of your book.
Oh, that's really bad.
It's so beautiful.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna Google it. I should totally.
I'm sorry.
Let me tell you.
I'm sure somebody on the chat can Google
James
it.
Merrill. James.
Say it again.
James
Merrill. Okay.
And it was, I'll put it in the chat, and it was taken from his autobiography.
Thank you.
Okay, great. James Merrill, Merrill. Perfect. Okay. Then we have, who did we have next? We had Samir. Thanks, Pearl. Let me just get Samir. There you go.
Hey, hey, Alya, I just wanted to know, because obviously it's a really interesting journey you've been on. And I'm guessing maybe you started more of it as like a introverted person, and I think you became more extroverted, maybe over time. Just wanted to know from you, like with this lockdown period, what have you kind of learned about yourself through this lockdown period? And is that accurate, the first part of my question? Did you go from more of an introverted person to an extrovert?
I actually feel like it was the opposite. I feel like I was really extroverted. I was always out, like every single day. I was always super social. And, my friends have been making fun of me because during this lockdown period, they've basically been like, you've already done this. Because while I was writing my book, I basically didn't see anyone. And I just like locked myself in my house for about 2 years. So they're like, you've got good practice with this because you've been doing this. But I think I've learned, and maybe it's like bad because I feel like I live alone and I've just gotten so used to and just quite happy in my own company, basically. And I'm just not sure that I'm ever going to want to spend time with anyone ever again.
Okay, that's
not true. I definitely miss people. But yeah, I think I just learned how to kind of tap into, and that's not to say that I don't have hard days, and I definitely have days where I feel really sad or whatever, but I feel like I've learned how to tap into the things that make me happy, and, kind of fostering an environment which best serves that.
Okay. Okay, that's a cool answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amir. We have Rosie.
Thank you so much for your time. My question's about audience. I work in the publishing industry, and I've felt that to promote Arab voices or to acquire books, from more diverse backgrounds, I've often had to work a little harder to make the case for why an American audience should and would care. And I was wondering if in your writing you felt like you've had to do a similar justification or explanation of yourself, and whether that question of audience seeps into your writing.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think, and it might be a bit different in the UK versus US, I'm not sure, but I've definitely been having this conversation a lot with my, other minority ethnic friends and journalists and storytellers. And, what a lot of people say is that a lot of the time it can be easier to get commissioned if you really kind of put your identity front and center. I think there's increasingly this idea of like representation matters, which of course it does, but there's still this kind of narrow idea of what kind of representation that is. So I know that even, when I was initially pitching this book, I definitely got a few no's where it was like, oh no, like they didn't say it in exactly these words, but it was essentially like, you're not Arab enough, right? Because my story is, I'm not veiled and I drink alcohol and you know what I mean? Which sounds ridiculous to say because obviously there's so many people like that. And that doesn't mean that I'm less Arab or more British or whatever. But I feel like that didn't tie into the idea of what certain white publishers thought that Arab was. So it wasn't ticking their diversity box in the way that they would have liked it to, if you see what I mean. So I think it's really tricky because I feel like there is this pressure to be like, look how different I am, look how different I am, when actually there's so many things that we have obviously similar as well. And it's quite a shame and a waste to sort of have to play up to these expectations. I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but I feel like at the end of the day, again, I think the more that we have, the more we will understand that there are lots of different ways of being from a certain culture or from a certain place or whatever, and they're all equally as important.
Great question, Rosie. Thanks so much. We have one final question from Sada. Sada?
Hi again. My question is about Backlash, how you've dealt with it. I know that it's inevitable, and I'm more curious about the inward part because you can speak to obviously like communication and all of that, but what it's done to you personally and how you've dealt with that.
Yeah. At the beginning, especially, I definitely was like refreshing all the reviews and like actively seeking out bad reviews, which I just don't know why our brains work like that. Like, why the hell would I do that to myself?
Right.
And that was initially really upsetting. And I think what I ended up having to do is sort of switching off from that. It's not to say that, everyone has to agree with me or else your opinion is not valid. Of course not. But I think it's the way that people, like, if you're just being mean to be mean, then that's not helpful for me or for anyone, So I think it's kind of realizing what is the intention behind this negative feedback or whatever. And I think it's sort of, figuring that out, because at the end of the day, you can't please everyone, nor are you supposed to, nor is that like a good use of your time, So I think it's kind of like figuring out what your minimal viable audience is, which is essentially the people that it's resonating with, the people that it's positively impacting, the ways in which your work is serving yourself and the people that it's serving. And if you don't get it, if it's not for you, then that's totally fine. Like, there'll be something else that's for you, but there's no need for me to martyr myself at the hands of like someone who doesn't like it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Alya. For those of you who don't already follow Alya, she's very available to be followed. So just search her name, and you can find her on Instagram, which is how we originally found her. I just personally, I love how available you are, not only sort of in terms of responding to stuff, but how available you are in the work that you publish. So thanks so much for being available to us as a community and for joining us. The last question I'll ask you before you jump off is, what are you working on now?
I'm working on some really exciting things, which I don't feel ready to share just yet because they're not ready to be shared. But I think definitely, you know, again, so much of what I try and do and so much of what I want to continue doing is essentially being honest, providing these narratives that I don't feel are currently in the world in the way that I want them to be. It's easier to be yourself if you can see yourself, and I want us to be able to see ourselves in all the different mediums, all the different ways. So that's what I'm working on.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. For all of you on the call, thanks so much for joining. I posted 2 links into the chat. The first is a feedback form. Please give us feedback on how today's event went. The second is our Patreon account. So if you're interested in supporting us and keep us going and growing, please consider becoming a supporter. Be a friend, subscribe to our podcast and our YouTube page, and see you guys next week or next event.
Thank
you, everybody.
So much.